Today, I am at Vereen Memorial Gardens. This place is right on the South Carolina state line, about an hour south of Wilmington. And it begins with this beautiful trail, and then it ends at a very interesting, beautiful kind of coastal area. It has this long pier that stretches out over the marsh and the sound. So that's where we're heading now. It is Pentecost Sunday. So I invite you now to hear these words of the Lord from Acts chapter 2. When the day of Pentecost came, they were all together in one place. Suddenly, a sound like the blowing of a violent wind came from heaven and filled the whole house where they were sitting. They saw what seemed to be tongues of fire that separated and came to rest on each of them. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit enabled them. Now there were staying in Jerusalem God-fearing Jews from every nation under heaven. When they heard this sound, a crowd came together in bewilderment because each one heard them speaking in their own language. Utterly amazed, they asked, "Are not all these men who are speaking Galileans? Then how is it that each of us hears them in his own native language?" The Pentecost story actually begins in Genesis chapter 11. If you remember, there's a little story in there about how humanity quite literally got very high on themselves. They were building this giant tower, this Tower of Babel, to reach heaven. They wanted to reach heaven themselves under their own power. Well, God didn't like that, of course, and so he broke them up. And the way he did it is that he created multiple languages so they couldn't really communicate with each other. And it broke up their progress. And they couldn't build this tower any longer. The Pentecost story kind of moves us past the Tower of Babel, and that the Spirit comes down and says there's still multiple languages, multiple ideologies and opinions, and multiple nationalities and ethnicities and languages, but there's one Spirit that ties us all back together. It's like God is taking the Tower of Babel story and he's putting a big old band-aid on it. And he's trying to bring us back together again. You know, if you're not a part of Harbor, you may not know that this Sunday, for the first time, we are having congregational singing for the first time since March of last year. It's going to feel so good to do it. But also, I think it's a healing moment in that COVID has kind of been like a Tower of Babel, and that it has worked to separate us. First, it was a kind of a forced isolation, but then because we couldn't see each other, because we couldn't hug each other, we became sort of apart. We sort of drifted apart from each other. I think we also began to watch the news more, and we allowed the news to inform what we believed about each other. And so this particular Pentecost season is an opportunity for all of us to reconnect, to come together, to move past the Tower of Babel, to recognize that we are many languages, but one Spirit. Years ago, my father had just retired, but he was asked by the bishop to come out of retirement to serve a small church in Clayton. They had about 100 people, but they had this crippling financial debt, and they really couldn't afford to exist, and it was just a really hard time for the church. And my father kind of went there to sort of get him through the hard time, to kind of give them a sense of identity. And he really fell in love with that church. I mean, he just loved it. And he felt a really heavy presence of the Holy Spirit. And he knew that God had an important plan for that church. But he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. And through the years after my father left, they've been trying to figure out, what do we do with this church? People just couldn't give up on it. People knew that there was something more to it. And so I hadn't thought about it in many years until 2 weeks ago. All the pastors were on a conference call with the bishop, and they announced, this is really cool, for the first time ever, there is going to be a church in our conference that would partner with an AME church, African Methodist church. The merging of two denominations, of two races, of two cultures, of two traditions, the merging of these two things into one church that would be Christ Community, my father's former church. I felt my eyes begin to water. I started to tear up just thinking about this beautiful, beautiful thing that was going to happen at this church that my dad had always sort of felt, but he couldn't quite put his finger on. And I knew that he was looking down from heaven, knowing this was happening. I knew that he was smiling. I think it's a beautiful vision. It's a beautiful vision of heaven, but it's also a Pentecostal vision. Many languages, one spirit, many races, many ethnicities, one spirit, one Lord of all. I don't know if you've ever played poker. I used to love playing poker. I never played for serious money. I just played for the fun of it. But when I played, I liked knowing that even if you got a bad hand, you could still win if you were good at the game of poker. There was a little less luck involved, right? And we often use this as a kind of a metaphor for life. Some people they're born into a bad hand, right? They're born into a third world country or into a family that's not very stable, or they're born with not a lot of means and a lack of education, and we can't help the hand we're dealt. And so some of us have to work harder, right? And that's true. That is very true. But in a broader sense, the Holy Spirit comes to us on Pentecost Sunday and says, the way that we treat one another is like we're sitting across from them at a poker table, or they're the opposing team on a basketball court, or they're a competing business. The Holy Spirit asks us to turn our cards around, to show others our card. Life is not about winning. It's not about being the best. It's not about being on top of someone else. Life is about coming together. It's about love. That is the work of the Holy Spirit. Life is not a game of poker. I was walking through the streets of Savannah this week. We were on vacation. We love Savannah. And so I was jogging around the big park there, and I was coming back from my jog. And if you've ever walked through Savannah, you got to stop quite a bit at these streets because there's a lot of crosswalks. And so I'm not about the jaywalk in a town like that. In fact, I actually got to the intersection, and there was a police station right there in the intersection. And I knew I was definitely not going to jaywalk right next to a police station. And there was a police officer right on the corner. And so I'm looking at the road, there's no cars coming, but there's a sign that says don't cross. And the police officer leans over and he says, "Hey man, it's cool, you can go on ahead." And I looked at the sign that said don't cross. And so I was like, "Are you sure?" He's like, yeah, go on ahead, it's fine, really. And so I said, okay. And I began walking across the street. And I kept looking back at him like, is this cool? Like, is this a trick? Am I gonna be arrested? The Holy Spirit comes to us, and we call the Holy Spirit a paraclete, which is another way of saying helper. The Holy Spirit helps us. It gives us a leg up. It gives us guidance. It gives us that nudge forward to say, hey, it's okay to cross that street. Sometimes it happens in subtle ways. Sometimes it happens in overt ways. Sometimes it happens gently or harshly even. But you always look to the Holy Spirit to say when and where you're supposed to do something. That guidance is important. We're getting to the area here where it really opens up and you see this beautiful coastal area. But many people don't understand how to relate to the Holy Spirit. I think of it as a helper on the street corner who comes to you and says, it's okay, go forward. It's okay, I'm with you, go forward. It's okay, I'm watching after you. That's the paraclete. That's the Holy Spirit, nudging us forward, showing us, guiding us where to go in life. Okay, you can see it's really opened up here. There's this huge pier, it begins all the way down here, and it stretches all the way over here, and people are going across it. We're going to get there in a second. There's a story, a really great story. It's about a young woman. You can watch this online. It's probably on YouTube. It's about a young woman who's kind of at the end of her rope. She had just given birth, but she was a heroin addict. She didn't have a job. She was really in dire straits. And one night around 2 a.m., she reached for a phone number. It was a number that her mother had given her. It was the number of a pastoral counselor her mother said that she should call and schedule an appointment with. So at 2 a.m., as her young child was asleep, she was wrestling with heroin. She called this number. And the voice on the other end picked up, and she said, I just got to talk to someone. And he said, sure, sure. And she just confessed her heart. She poured her heart out, and he would occasionally nod and sort of agree, but also give her affirmation and challenge and try to help her as much as he could. They talked all night long. And when morning came at the end, she said, you're really, really good at this. Thank you for taking my call. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being so good at your job. And he said, I got to tell you something. I'm actually not a pastoral counselor. You dialed the wrong phone number. He said the number you dialed was of me. I'm not a counselor, but I just couldn't let you go. You just sounded like you needed someone to talk to. You could call that a happy accident, but as Christians, we believe that those are the movements of the Holy Spirit. Those are the sort of nudges of the Paraclete, kind of working things out to help us along, to help us get across to that next street. And she says in that story, if you have even just a pinhole of hope, God's mercy will come flooding in. So now I walked at the end of a very long pier, you can see here, and I've made it to the coastline. This is the Intercoastal. There's tons of boats, but this beach here is beautiful. It is all oyster shells. It's really remarkable. And one of the things you do here when you come is you grab an oyster shell and you say a prayer or you make a wish and you hang it on one of the bushes here. We'll do that in a second. But I just want to close by saying, first of all, the Holy Spirit is not here to make us happy, to make us hopeful. It's to do those things, but also to guide us, to empower us, to nudge us across the street. The Holy Spirit is here to finish God's work. So I invite you all to have a meaningful day of Pentecost. And now I am going to hang these oyster shells.
I know thou art mine. For thee all the folly of sin I resign. My gracious Redeemer, my Savior, art thou. If ever I